Well, let's bring on our guest.
Let's do it.
All right, so we have Mark Dudzic here to talk about the Labor Party. Mark is the national coordinator of the Labor Campaign for Single Payer. He's the former national organizer for the Labor Party and the former president of Local 8 149 of the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers. Thanks for coming, Mark.
Yeah, great to be here.
So maybe I'll start out with this. Can you talk a little bit more about your union, the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers, that you came out of? And, what factors do you think made it, the union, the place where the Labor Party idea was born?
Yeah, well, I mean, this was, it's a core industrial union. It's now part of the steel workers, but it represents oil refinery workers, chemical workers, and a bunch of related industrial workers. And, it comes out of the CIO side of the labor movement coming out of the 1940s, and kept a lot of the characteristics of the CIO in terms of, a real militant approach to trade unionism, a real focus on internal membership participation and mobilization, and, was in battle with some of the biggest corporations in the history of capitalism. And they, particularly the oil industry, never really accepted trade unionism in the way that auto did and steel and a lot of the other core industries. So there was never that moment in the 1950s where we became junior partners with our employers. We never even won a union shop language in most of the big oil companies until the early years of the 21st century. So there was a militant tradition that kind of guided what we were doing, and we got hit hard in the 1980s with the rise of neoliberalism and the corresponding deindustrialization and all of the attacks on labor. And so we were really ready to really begin to think about what was causing these things and what we needed to do to build political power for working people. We also had come out of a real tough fight in the early 70s for occupational health and safety that kind of created a culture in the union that was very willing to think very expansively about who we need to bring into our fights in order to build the power that we need to take on these enemies. And I think that also kind of led to this understanding. And we, finally there, we were privileged to have some really visionary leaders in our union, and particularly a guy named Tony Mizaki, who I was so lucky to have met and worked with very closely. He came out of the same local union that I was a member of. He really helped lead a transformative process in our union that resulted in us leading an effort to build a labor-based political party in the 1990s.
So I want to jump in and ask if you could explain what the difference is between a labor party and other political parties. And when I say other political parties, I think I'm thinking specifically of, the third parties that have been around kind of forever throughout American history. I know, there's been a little bit of cross-pollination between the Labor Party and the Green Party. I think I read that Ralph Nader came and spoke at the 1996 founding convention. But what is the difference between the Labor Party and some of these other political parties?
Yeah, well, I mean, when you say the Labor Party, I mean, I can only speak to the Labor Party that we were trying to build in the 90s and the early 2000s. Our understanding was that, politics needed to be rooted, in real, as you all were discussing earlier in the call, in real working class constituencies, that it had to have a real a base, that it rather than just sort of an abstract program that might relate to certain working class issues. It really had to come out of and be accountable to real constituencies. And that in fact, those constituencies were not fully formed, and that the first task of party building then had to be to to build those constituencies by having really deep conversations with workers and with the institutions that represent workers, particularly unions, about what politics ought to look like if it was conducted on behalf of the great majority of people in this country who work for a living or who would need to work for a living in order to survive. And, you know, that's very different from sort of the idea that you were talking about, if we build it, they will come, or, you know, we used to call it building the ark, you know, and just waiting for the flood. You know, this idea that if you come up with the perfect program or the perfect letterhead, that somehow working people will flock to your party. Or then, you know, the other thing that I see in a lot of these third-party efforts is it's more sort of like a reflecting a lifestyle choice or a branding or something. It's like, you know, people want to bear witness rather than actually create political change. There's no sense of how to build power. It's all about, well, you know, I'm going to vote for the Green Party because I don't want to be tainted. You know, it's like I'm going to wear fair trade clothes so I can show the world that, you know, I don't believe in the exploitation of child labor. But, you know, you're not really affecting the conditions that give rise to those problems. You're just bearing witness yourself, and that's a real problem with a lot of these parties. They're really, I think, tend to be very what did they call Bhaskar, self-indulgent? You know.
Yeah, that's.
There's something to be said for that, you know. So,
what kind of factors do people need to take into account before thinking about embarking on something like this? And like, what factors were present that made people think in the 90s that this could actually go somewhere?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question, Paul. I think what we saw in the 90s was we experienced 12 years of the rise of neoliberalism. You know, the two Reagan administrations and George W. Bush, or George Bush the first, you know, sort of consolidated neoliberalism. It was a real shock to the labor movement and many other social movements. You know, it took labor probably 10 years to figure out that there had really been a permanent realignment of power and class forces that the Reaganism represented. And so we experienced this very viscerally. It was a, you know, time of union busting, massive deindustrialization, you know, the attacks on poor people. And then you know, comes 1992. We, you know, the sort of pro-working class folks elected Bill Clinton president. And, you know, there was a real anticipation that maybe we could begin to turn things around as a result of that. And then what happened instead is that we, the working class, got the NAFTA agreement, which institutionalized the sort of new global trade regime. We got so-called welfare reform, which eliminated the right of folks to a basic living, said we no longer had that right, and all of the other things that the Clintons gave us. We got failed healthcare reform, the rise of mass incarceration. All of these dynamics sort of emerged as Clinton embraced a neoliberal policy. So that created a huge amount of ferment within the labor movement, and it resulted in a real push for change. And, you know, the Labor Party movement was part of that. You know, we launched Labor Party Advocates in, I'm thinking 1991, 92. But, you know, there was also a real challenge for the leadership of the AFL-CIO. There was a successful challenge in the Teamsters Union. We had a insurgent candidacy led by Kerry that won in the Teamsters Union. We challenged and won. Sweeney won the presidency of the AFL-CIO, and his program was to sort of adopt a more militant approach, more confrontational approach to trade unionism, and to focus on organizing. And, we laid out a program that was going to organize 1 million new workers a year into the union. Obviously, it didn't work out, but, this was a brief moment of upsurge in the working class movement. And, within that context, the idea was that a working class movement that's on the move, that's organizing 1 million workers a year, is going to have the kind of momentum and dynamism that could actually develop a movement of independent working class politics that could really break with the Democratic Party and launch a party of our own. And so that was sort of the motion that brought us to this Labor Party moment in the mid-1990s.
And so as it was getting started, the Labor Party advocates, which unions became bought into the idea of a Labor Party and supported it? And what do you think it was about those unions that made them more receptive?
Yeah, well, there were a whole lot more unionized industrial workers in the 90s than there are today. And a lot of the momentum for the Labor Party came out of those unions, because that was sort of the tip of the spear in terms of experiencing neoliberalism. And so, there was a number of industrial unions, large locals, and other sectors that were really at the core of the Labor Party movement. And then some elements of new unionism. The California nurses had just experienced an insurgency that had transformed that union, which had been sort of a professional association, transformed it into a real fighting union, and they embraced the vision of a Labor Party. And some of the new organizing in SEIU and some other things, locals came together around this issue. But a lot of the public sector and service unions were not as involved in it back then as they would probably tend to be today, because of the different economic dynamics that took place in the meantime.
So I want to dive in and ask you about some of the internal workings of the Labor Party. So you had written at one point, let me find the quote. You wrote, in the 90s, the Labor Party, quote, avoided the expediency of identity politics and liberal talking points and instead organized around broad class-based interests and concerns. Mm-hmm. And that statement really struck me, because it sounds a lot like what Bernie Sanders tried to do, right? That was a huge part of his project. And I guess what got me thinking is a lot of people tried to use that tactic against him. A lot of the Democratic Party elite, would come out and say things like, well, you're not focusing enough on, what we might call identity politics, or, your universal programs are somehow, incomplete or racist or something, because, they don't give enough weight to identity concerns. So I guess my question for you is, how were you able to kind of navigate those issues in the 90s and avoid, as you say, the expediency of these liberal talking points and identity politics? And do you have any thoughts on how we might continue that project now?
Yeah, well, by the way, Bernie appropriated our whole program. So, including free higher ed, which we spent a lot of time developing. And Adolph Reed was central to that campaign. So,
goddamn sectarian Bernie.
The whole thing, we organized on the right to a job. Mm-hmm. We called it just healthcare, Medicare mm-hmm. for all, mm-hmm. free higher education, the right to organize, family leave. These were core issues that moved working people in. And look, I think just like Bernie, I think we basically kept our eye on the prize and organized around the issues that brought working people to the table, and pulled together a multiracial working class movement. These are issues that will build the unity and the power that we need in order to win victories for all working people. And so that was always the central focus of what we did. And people had many other issues and concerns, and we tried to create, just like you do in a union hall or a union organizing drive, you respect and allow people to give voice to those issues and concerns, but you focus on the issues that you can focus on and that you can make progress on, and other things you just have to put aside for another day until you build the kind of unity and power that you can achieve it. So, I remember we had this big debate once about Nixon was bombing Serbia. There's a big crisis with Albanian autonomy, and it's a whole mess in Serbia. And people were like, we got to take a position. We've got to take a stand on this issue of the bombing of Serbia. And it was like, I said at one point that whatever position we take will have absolutely no impact on the policy of bombing Serbia, because we have no power to influence that policy. So let's talk about what it will take to build the power so that we can weigh in on things like that. And that's really the idea of party building, is you build, around the issues that will unify and build power, not around the issues that will, be sort of boutique issues that satisfy various constituencies.
And can you talk about the corporate power and the American Dream education program and the other kind of issue-based campaigns the Labor Party ran?
Yeah, sure. So we worked with a group called the Labor Institute, who had, still specializes in, a model of worker-centered education. And we developed a training program called Corporate Power and the American Dream, which, basically, gave workers the tools to sort of understand how capitalism works, and how we can build some alternatives to it. We didn't put it quite in those terms back in the 90s, but we used this program and we rolled it out. And the idea was to get local unions and labor federations to sponsor these trainings. It was a day-long training program, and thousands of workers went through this program, and it kind of helped to create sort of a common narrative and a common understanding about what we're doing and why we're doing it. And then, we tried to connect that work to the sort of issue or organizing work and agitational work around these issues of, of jobs and healthcare and education and family leave and, all of the other issues that a working class program ought to connect with.
So I want to fast forward a little bit to ask you about the possibilities, I guess, for kind of restarting or thinking again about something similar to the Labor Party now. I know that in 2012, you wrote a kind of postmortem with Catherine Isaac about, the kind of rise and fall of the Labor Party with some lessons and challenges for the future. And you had mentioned in that piece that, again, back in 2012, this is not the right time to restart the Labor Party. There's work that we can be doing, but we obviously can't have a Labor Party without a labor movement. And at that time, the labor movement, was so weakened and so under attack that it just didn't seem like a feasible project. Now, I don't think that much has changed since 2012. However, I will say that there have been a few events. I'm thinking here of course, the two Bernie Sanders campaigns, and then the kind of wave of strikes in 2018, most notably the teacher strikes. Of course, I don't think that means that the labor movement is completely back on its feet by any stretch of the imagination. But I'm wondering what you think of those developments and whether that changes any of the assessments you made in 2012.
Yeah, I think there has been some real changes. I think I can't speak for my colleague who I wrote that article with, but I think I, to some degree, underestimated the ability to use a class-oriented electoral challenge to pull together a labor labor-based program. I think Bernie did that masterfully, and particularly in 2016. And it got such a response because there is so much anger about the inequality and the power of capital and its impact on people's lives, and the failure of the Democratic establishment to address those issues in any coherent way. So there are, I think there's more opportunities to talk about independent working class politics today than there was in 2012. I think the labor movement has a long way to go before we could talk about it being a resurgent labor movement. But that these things could happen very quickly in the same way that Bernie Sanders' vision took hold and motivated millions of people. I think there are a lot of signs out there that say that working people, both inside and outside unions, are in a place where if the right combination of internal and external events come together, there could be a real momentum towards a resurgent labor movement. And then everything's off the table. Then we have to look at what's possible and how we're going to do it. I don't think we want to be formulaic on exactly how the next push towards working class politics plays out in the U.S. There's all kinds of unique challenges and problems in the political system, but the goal has got to be to construct an independent working class politics and use that as a basis to build a real organization that has a real constituency and is really connected to the felt concerns of working people.
So in I guess the ashes of the 2016 Bernie campaign, there were several people who had worked on his campaign and surrogates who started getting the ball rolling on this idea for a third party. I think they called it the People's Party. There was a movement in 2016 to draft Bernie to that party after he had sort of dropped out of the race, and that movement is still going forward. I believe they just had a big convention last year. Cornel West, Nina Turner, and some other people like Chris Hedges were there and they spoke. And this was obviously born out of, as we've been talking about, this very deep dissatisfaction with the Democratic Party, especially after the Democratic Party elite sabotaged Bernie, in many ways during the primaries. And this is not a Labor Party, insofar as, from what I can tell, it hasn't really started with unions the way that, the 1996 Labor Party did, but is instead looking to sort of reach across a couple different organizations. And I think they say on their website that, unions will be part of that process at some point. But I'm wondering if you have any thoughts, either just on this particular project, if you know much about it, or just on the feasibility of an independent working class, organ, as you say, that is kind of combination, labor and I guess you could say like advocacy groups, especially given that union density in the US is still so low.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not intimately connected with that process, but I don't think it's built the kind of momentum at this point that can kind of break out. It looks like it's the usual suspects who've signed on. Again, I don't think that there's a understanding of how you need to build and organize a constituency, as a fundamental precondition. Labor is not at the table, and I think we've came to the conclusion that labor and other social movements have to be at the table from the beginning, or else they're never going to come to the table. They have to be part of the process that builds these things, and if they're not ready to come to the table, then we have to create the conditions that'll bring them to the table, not just go ahead and set the table without them. Mm-hmm. And that's sort of where we are in politics right now. That these things have to happen. the stakes in politics, moving through the Trump years were very high, and the ability to think of any kind of a spoiler type party in that moment was, almost impossible. Anybody who was connected to the real world and real organizing, would have just shuddered at the thought that, anything that we could do, anything that we did that would increase the chances that Trump regime would stay in power, was just anathema to most organizers and activists. So now, we see what the next few years bring to this moment. That's, can the Biden administration co-opt some of this energy around working class concerns and working class politics, and co-opt enough of it to keep the Democratic Party in the game? I don't know. I don't think so ultimately, but I don't know if you measure that in months and years or in decades at this point.
So I have a kind of related follow-up to that, and that's, for people who are readers of Jacobin or familiar with the work in Jacobin, lots of Jacobin writers kind of try to get at this question from time to time. I'm thinking here of Seth Ackerman, who has a great piece called "A Blueprint for a New Party," where he basically advocates starting. I'm like paraphrasing his article a lot. I encourage everyone to read it, but he advocates starting, a working class party, something that very much resembles the 1996 Labor Party, except with the exception that we should not be pursuing the ballot line, because his argument is that, it differs from state to state. It's so difficult to try to win it. And it's just a huge time suck. And I know that was something that, the Labor Party also debated or also was thinking about at the time. And the Labor Party was successful in getting the ballot line in South Carolina. But I'm wondering what you think of that strategy, and whether pursuing a ballot line is something that, the left should continually do, or if it's a little premature.
Yeah, look, I thought Seth's article was really interesting and really grappled with, the realities of the constructed political system in the U.S. So, I think there's really interesting ideas. I think the only thing I would say that would be critical is that I think it's getting a little bit ahead of ourselves to, think exactly what that party and that movement is going to look like. But, I think it's actually useful when you talk to, people who are engaged in politics, trade unionists and other social movement folks, and they say, well, how are we going to do this? Aren't we going to open up the floodgates to, a right-wing resurgence and stuff? To use some of the concepts that Seth explored in that article to talk through that. But, really the real problem and the real challenge is, let's build the freaking constituency that can build a party, and they'll figure out how we move it forward, and how we gain a political voice. But again, we're not going to build the party over sort of structural proposals about how to use the electoral system. We're going to build the party around a demand for working class politics, and then we need the technical stuff follows the political stuff.
Yeah, that just reminds me, since we were talking about Nader earlier, I wanted to briefly mention that at least in 2000, and I think this has happened several times since then, there's a lot of talk of vote swapping. So like people in, safe states were encouraged to swap their vote for, Kerry or Gore, whoever, with somebody in a swing state who wanted to vote for Nader. And that's an example of, I think, the kind of like technical hack that a lot of people want to bring forth to try to break or, hack the two-party system somehow. And it didn't work then, and it doesn't work now. Yeah. I think this happened again in 2016. And because it's, the digital age, lots of people were like, we have an app for this. But needless to say, we know how that turned out.
You know, what can I say? I mean, it's just so maybe you feel good about that Nader got more votes, but where does it go? And look, I think Ralph Nader has done a lot of has really pointed out a lot of the contradictions in the system, and has been very consistent and did not lose the 2000 election for Gore and all of that shit. But it's like, what's where are you left when all of that happens? When you do, let's say you develop the perfect app, and every Pennsylvania voter who wanted to vote for Ralph got a New York voter to vote for him. So what? So we got 100,000 New York votes for Ralph Nader. Where have we changed the fundamental dynamics of the political system?
And I can say that no one in Philly is going to try and help out a New Yorker through an app.
So we can count out Pennsylvania as a swing state swap. All right.
Find your own swing state. Yeah.
Go ahead, Jen.
I was just going to I want to talk a little bit about the, I guess, downfall of the Labor Party, which you as I say, you've written about with Catherine Isaac, and one of the elements that you point out there is that the industrial unions that were kind of the core base of the Labor Party experienced a lot of erosion at the end of the 90s. So I'm wondering if we're thinking seriously about trying to not just revitalize the labor movement, but also, thinking about how we can start laying the groundwork for a possible future Labor Party, which sectors should we be looking at? Which sectors are strategic, and which would kind of be ripe for inclusion in a new Labor Party?
Yeah, I do think that we have to think about how to build the party on more than just a union base. I think in the mid 90s, you could still talk, even then it was, we needed to begin to address that issue, but you could still talk about unions as having a much more central representation of working class Americans than they do today. So, we have to begin to look out of the box. There's a lot of social movements around economic justice and social justice that have emerged. A lot of models that have emerged around worker centers and immigrant organizing and things that you can begin to build on that experience and think about some broader constituencies. But nonetheless, the institutional labor movement is the only real social movement that's funded exclusively by working class people and still has the substantial resources and organizing capacity that nobody else has. So they still need to be at the center of this party. And I guess you would look at where the motion is within the labor movement, and education workers are certainly central to that motion right now. The attacks on the public sector that have occurred and that will probably begin to occur again as we move more towards austerity, will call out a reaction. I'm really impressed with the fight that led by the postal unions, particularly American Postal Workers Union, against the privatization of the post office, and how they framed that in much broader terms in terms of public goods. So, a lot of those sections of the labor movement will come together. And I do think that there could very well be an explosion in organizing in the logistics sector and some related sectors that might really be the force that really drives the labor movement into a resurgence. I don't know about the Bessemer, Alabama, Amazon election, but there's something is going to begin to come together, particularly in logistics and those related industries, that I think will drive a real dynamism throughout the labor movement.
And so since the Labor Party folded, you've been mostly or very active with the labor campaign for single payer.
We don't say we folded. We say we put it on the shelf.
Put it on the shelf, right. I mean, you can fold and go on a shelf.
Okay.
So you've been active with the labor campaign for single payer, and specifically recently campaigning around the Healthcare Emergency Guarantee Act. I've been on a few Zoom calls with you about that. Can you just talk about that work and why do you think that's an important thing to be doing right now?
Yeah, well, I mean, it sort of came out of some of the organizing we were doing in the Labor Party, as well as other unionists who were organizing from other perspectives. But it's like this single issue, I think, that shows all of the sort of contradictions of capitalism that workers have to live under. It's a single winnable reform that could really make massive improvements in the security of almost every working class American. How precarious their access to healthcare is. Everybody knows that they're a job away from losing their healthcare and a major illness from bankruptcy under this system, and it's just driving massive insecurity. So it's to me, it's sort of like, if you want to talk about building a politics of labor and building a revitalized labor movement, Medicare for All is central to that project. We've been really working on it in that direction. We really saw the opportunity, as the pandemic hit and, tens of millions of workers lost their jobs and their access to healthcare. We really saw that there could have been a political opportunity to pass an emergency version of a sloppy emergency version of Medicare for All that said basically, we'll pay all your medical bills. If you have insurance, they have to continue to pay their portion and we'll pay the rest. If you lost your job, you don't have insurance, send the bills to Medicare and we'll pay it for the duration of the crisis. Would have been a simple solution. It didn't make it through the last round of bailout legislation. There's still some discussion about how to wrap it into some of these subsequent rounds. But those are the kind of issues I think that can really, pull together, broad constituencies. The work, Paul, that you and others have done in the Philadelphia area, where you got, 30 plus Philly unions, a major portion of the Philadelphia labor movement, to sign on to a call for to support the Emergency Guarantee Act and to pressure 3 key Congress people on that, I think is a model for how we see moving these kind of issues in the broader labor movement.
All right. Well, thanks for the Philly shout out. But I think that's all the questions we have. Thank you so much, Mark, for coming on. People should check out that article that was mentioned. There's also an interview in Jacobin about these issues. So thanks again, Mark, for coming on.
Great to be here. Wonderful discussion.
Thank you, Mark.
See ya.